From Coordinate Sports, it's The Drive Phase, a show about sports founders, leaders and experts and the stories behind their business journeys. Our guest on the show this week is Ollie Dudfield. Ollie has represented social impact and international development in sport for more than 15 years. He has established himself in the policy development and strategy space, leading the Commonwealth Secretariat on Sport for Development and Peace. He is now the Executive Director for the Sport for Development Coalition, looking to expand the outcomes of social impact in sport and grow the coalition to up to 400 members. Enjoy the show. Okay, so I'm delighted to be joined by Ollie Dudfield today. He's the Executive Director for the Sport for Development Coalition, and they're looking to expand the outcomes of social impact in sport and grow that coalition to over 400 members. Welcome to the show, Ollie.
Hi, James. Thanks for having us today.
Really looking forward to kind of diving in. I wanted to start was, we always start with childhood, but I was really interested where you were born. So it's called Ipswich now, right? But not the Ipswich that most of us would know in the UK.
No, not the Ipswich in Suffolk. Actually, Ipswich in Australia is where I spent most of my time and grew up.
And if you were going to look back on it, what would you describe your childhood as? Or how would you describe it?
Active in some ways, and probably a childhood where involvement in different areas of sport and the community around sport was an important part of the childhood, important part of engaging with others, and probably an important part of identity. So that possibly might help explain a bits and pieces of what I've done.
It's kind of everyone thinks about that, about Australia and kind of the culture of sport over there. Obviously, weather probably plays a strong part in it. But is that something that you had? Like, were you family active? And I guess school life's always interesting to us because a lot of our listeners are running businesses where they're really impacting on children's lives from a physical activity standpoint. What did that kind of look like for you growing up? Was it really active family life?
To an extent, I think certainly there's a component where expectation in some areas that you got involved in sport. There was elements around help people in the community, help people within, if you say, school environment have a sort of certain identity. So there was definitely that aspect, and there's probably a culture. There was a culture that sport was a good thing to do. Well, my perception was a culture sport was a good thing to do, and it was something that interested most people. I think as you get older and reflect on that, you get more and more of a sense that was probably for actually only one part of the community, only one part of young people, only a particular group for who sort of sport and the way sport's structured works for. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that. And certainly if I reflect back on when I was younger, as you asked, you had that sense that everyone wanted to be involved with sport. It gave you a good sense of identity amongst your peers. It gave you a way to connect with peers and others around. But you reflect back now and say, well, that's because, as I said, if you were involved in sport, there were plenty who I'm sure wasn't such a good experience and were probably outside of some of the teams, some of the organisations that I was lucky enough to be involved with. And so,
was it like a culture, like a more of a competitive culture that we might have, or we might feel is as healthy as it should be? You know what I mean? So, like you said, you kind of describing that pecking order. But yeah, if you're good at sport, then it's it kind of increases your status, I guess, in school, etc.
Yeah, and I think that is where that competitive culture comes from, and it's probably a good way to describe it. Now, that's not everyone's experience, and this is a number of years ago, of course, but certainly there was probably more of an orientation towards that sort of achievement, being a successful athlete or being involved in successful teams. Actually, some of the wider benefits that can come from being physically active, being involved in community sport initiatives, be they health, be they being able to be designed in a certain way to ensure they are more inclusive or do actually connect people in different parts of the community or from different backgrounds. And there's also there was also that sort of element that was almost a value to sport without having design it or having to be very strategic to ensure that value delivered for more people. And certainly that was probably the kind of understanding that I sort of reflect back on. But as you progress older, look back with hindsight, you could probably see there were definitely some elements of that sort of perception that probably were not the whole case, if you like. And I think about how many people I was involved in as a youngster involved in sport who were disabled people, had a long-term health condition, probably not many. Look at some of the diversity of some of the groups and clubs, organisations involved with, could have been certainly strengthened, and then particularly some of the elements that we look at around some gender stereotypes, gender attitudes could definitely have been strengthened. I think it's important to be able to look back, reflect on that. So your question asking about being young and like a child, it helps to sort of reflect back on some of those.
I was going to say basketball was your first love, right, in terms of sport. Is that right? Or would you say?
Yeah, good. We're doing this as audio only because standing at a grand total of 5'6", not many people believe that. But yes, that was one of the sports I was involved with. Then as I got a bit older, it became the main sport that I was involved with.
Because obviously, leading on from school education into your career, you managed to land a role in basketball, right, early on. Was that with New Zealand?
Well, in Australia and New Zealand. So first part of my career was more at that elite end, more in the sort of talent development into elite space within the national systems in both Australia and then into New Zealand.
So did you study, literally you went into, was that kind of your focus, rather get into sport and I want to be part of the coaching setup, obviously player coaching, the elite levels, that where you desired to be?
Well, my academic background's in humanities. And in fact, a significant part was the Paris School of Semiotics, slightly different to the typical sports science, sports management approach. But again, it was probably because the progression into the professional realm of sport, and in my case as a coach, was more through your progression as a player, your progression as a coach within the system, and that allows you to progress into a professional role in the talent development into the sort of national system, as opposed to the higher education route being seen as an avenue into that career path. Slightly different if you're on more the sport management, sport administration side. So hence that's why someone who's got a humanities background ended up working in this sector. Needless to say, I probably didn't have too many conversations about the Paris School of Semiotics and Roland Barthes.
The quotes that don't come up courtside very often.
In the basketball space, that's for sure.
So, so you're at New Zealand basketball, for a few years there and successful in the role. And what was it that, because obviously you made the jump to, was it UK Sport after that?
It was, yes.
Is that what brought you over to the UK? And I'm guessing just for that role, or were you heading over here anyway?
No, I came over for the role, probably for two reasons or two elements that appealed to me. That was in the days when the important component of UK sports work or international work was managing the UK's international cooperation around community sport and sport for development. So the opportunity to engage with partners in a whole range of different countries and contexts appealed to me. But I think the other side, I was very firmly sort of in the coach development, workforce development space then, was also moving from more of a focus on that sort of competitive talent development side of sport to starting to have that real interest in how do you maximise some of the wider benefits, some of the societal benefits of sport. And I can tell you, even though I didn't study at that point, it was my academic background in sport, had a sort of good, long enough career in sport, but there was a pretty steep learning curve in terms of moving from the sort of sport realm into utilising sport as to deliver those wider social outcomes. But the international facing aspect, and that is element of being able to use sport for those wider outcomes, was what appealed to me and what brought me over to UK Sport.
What if you were going to reflect back on that time? What you said there about the kind of difference between that elite level approach and the sport for development approach. Do you think from then to now, what's kind of the, I'd say, like distance travel? So what's the difference between what it was like then when you first jumped in and obviously a lot of work's gone on into to where we are now?
Well, there's probably two components. I think credit where credit's due. The work in a UK context on using sport within court other policy areas or other outcomes, whether it be helping to prevent entrance to justice system, supporting educational pathways, has always sort of been on the radar of the UK system. And so there was some sort of institutional knowledge there. And we're talking here sort of 15 or more years ago. So being able to engage with some of those stakeholders was of value. But I think the other side, and to answer your question, the increasing integration, if you like, of best practice in social policy and best practice, if I talk from my international development days, of international development into how design, deliver, monitor, evaluate, and learn from sport-based policy or programs, probably over the last 2 decades has extended a lot. So I think mid-2000s, if you ask people what's their sort of theory of change or program logic around how you're going to utilize sport to, say, help prevent entry to the justice system, there would be some of the leading actors would be able to very much articulate, well, what are the kind of specific mechanisms that they use to maximize the positive aspects of sport. But a number would say, we just do sport, and sport's positive, it has positive outcomes. But I think there's been that real realization over that ensuing time that sport's quite a malleable tool. It can be stretched or moved to have very positive outcomes, but also, and we're seeing this, we think about the UK context around some of the duty of care work and then really important shifts in policy and practice around really putting safeguarding, putting duty of care, putting the rights of the participants and athletes at the centre of what we do. There's been an understanding that we need to ensure the design of policies, programs, interventions really ensure the positive aspects are maximised rather than make the assumption that there's always going to be positive outcomes. And that's probably been a key shift that I've seen, and a really important shift over the ensuing sort of decade or so.
Definitely. I mean, from my point of view, obviously interested software company, obviously interested in tech, etc., and data. And one of the themes that we have they've come up a few times on the show is that way of being able to capture, but also to, I guess, articulate the benefits sport has. So it's like you said, it's going to affect all these different areas. But how could we? It's hard to kind of quantify. We did this program in this area, and then that has, because it's prevented things happening. So it's hard to measure them if they didn't happen. And that's one of the things that, it's interesting to get your take on it, or kind of the state of, are we using data and those tools? Because obviously there's a lot of things that are kind of out there in silos. We can bring it all together and show the wider impact. I guess that's the dream, to be able to say, funded this program and we've prevented X amount of entries to the justice system or admissions to hospital or whatever it be.
Well, I think I always say, and you touched on it there, it's very hard to measure something that hasn't happened. And so that is a challenge. But what we have learned, and I think certainly position the 200 plus organisations and networks in the coalition have sort of come. There is an importance of the balance between utilising validated tools and processes from other sectors within our monitoring and evaluation approaches. And so, for example, there's work going on in the coalition for a number of organisations to utilise the Office of National Statistics for subjective wellbeing questions within their monitoring evaluation process. That's an important element, but then it has to be balanced with the very context-specific, program-specific elements that we want to understand that are relevant for the participants who are driving or as part of a program, the community they're in, and the challenges that are faced. So getting that balance is quite important, because on one hand, the credibility of sport as an intervention requires us to be able to almost compare some of the results to other sectors, other areas, using sort of tools that are respected and validated through rigorous sort of academic and, if you like, policy-related processes. But equally, it's important we measure results, measure impact, because we want to learn and improve the experience, improve the results for those who are at the centre of what we're talking about, those who are participating, those who are involved in the program. So again, that balance is quite important. It's something what is on the radar strongly for the coalition, and while we are working on some shared measurement work, but also positioning that within a much broader sort of monitoring, evaluation and learning. But I think the other point is, and you touched on it, it's often difficult in a range of social sort of policy interventions to get that cause-effect relationship between the intervention, in this case using sport, and some quite complex outcomes, be they, as you said, issues around involvement in the justice system, whether educational attainment and results, whether it be social cohesion, very complex issues, a range of factors that determine what the outcome will be for individuals or communities. And in that context, I think it's as important to be able to speak and articulate very clearly what we feel the mechanisms of change are and the contributions that sport makes. And it may be that we have a coach/mentor as opposed to just a traditional coach. It may be this close work with referral agencies to ensure that actually it's the right opportunity for young people coming into the program. There might be a curriculum which either utilises learning within the sporting experience or links learning to the sporting experience. But I think being able to speak very clearly about the mechanisms of change and then how we will, if you like, try to understand the effectiveness of those mechanisms much more than often using the term we hear a lot around the power of sport because that reduces our credibility with other sort of policymakers, other sectors. So the monitoring and evaluation, the evidence and the impact is a challenge for a lot of people in social policy areas. But I think that's critical is that we can talk to, well, these are the mechanisms that we feel are helping contribute to what we're trying to achieve through this project, program or intervention.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think where you've got funding, especially large amounts of funding, and it's targeted at sport, it's easy to be kind of linear with it. Say, well, did this sport and this. So I look around kind of child weight management and things like that, where physical activity, if it was pushing this, everyone needs to be active. But then there's some other critical success factors that need to be, nutrition, etc., home life, all those things. If you can, let's say you're doing, look at those metrics to say a clearer picture, I think it's definitely the way to go. So I'm just going to run back. After UK Sport, you spent time at the Commonwealth in government role. I guess similar positions, what you're doing in terms of sharing that best practice across internationally with UK Sport. Was it a similar role, or how was it? What were you doing over there?
There are some similarities, but a lot of differences. And the main difference was Commonwealth Secretariat is the intergovernmental organisation of the member countries of the Commonwealth. So you're working with governments and working with national governments as opposed to the UK Sports sort of partnership. There was definitely an element with other sports councils, with other community actors, but it was probably more a sort of program partnership level, whereas the Commonwealth Secretariat is about policy. It's about national policy and strategy and about trying to, if you like, facilitate connections and sharing between different member countries who wanted to develop national policies and strategies to use sport and physical activity to contribute to their national development goals, health and well-being, social cohesion, gender equality, and how and why they're reforming those national policies and strategies to use sport in that way. So, slightly different. A basketball coach from Ipswich and then sitting there, and we do a lot of work in the UN system and a lot of work in that sort of multilateral intergovernmental system. So it was an interesting number of years, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I'll get in there sharing that best practice or those case studies or that kind of policy strategies across. I guess it's always good to have a look at who are leading, if that makes sense. A lot of work getting done across the Commonwealth, but were you generally pushing on showcasing work from the UK, or was it work further afield, or some? I guess would there be some highlights you could pick out that really kind of stood out?
No, probably very rarely sharing work from the UK. I mean, certainly the elements. I think there's been some changes in the policy environment in the UK around the type of organisations, the importance of community-based organisations, as opposed to perhaps the very traditional sport organisations, if you want to use sport for a social outcome. And so some of that was certainly put in the conversation. You've got some countries like Jamaica who've really committed to positioning physical activity within preventative health and then sport within prevention of young people at risk of gang affiliation or being involved in sort of at-risk activities. And the sort of commitment where, for example, in Jamaica's National Development Plan, sport is a quite important part of a number of aspects of that National Development Plan, which are not related to sport-based outcomes. Of course, they have a very well-known elite sports side, but around community safety, sports there, around health and well-being, physical activity is embedded there. You have sort of long tradition of very innovative work in sport for development in sub-Saharan Africa, and you've got some leaders in this space globally from Zambia, from South Africa into Botswana. And so some of the sort of community up or community driven sort of approaches to sport for development were certainly shared shared more broadly. And then you've got different contexts. So a number of small island developing states, very small context, small countries, and so very different contexts of some of the bigger countries. And what it sort of, I guess, a learning was the context is so important. And so when we put that into, say, domestic context in the UK, actually, there's a diverse range of contexts in the UK. And so actually, at the moment, it's very useful because in the coalition, trying to link those organisations where there's more similarities in the context that they're working, the size of their organisation, the challenges they're facing, rather than just saying, well, the big organisations have all the solutions. And I think that's an important learning I took from those years.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you touched on the coalition. It's probably a good time to look at kind of the scope and kind of objectives of the coalition, and maybe talk about your journey to be in the role you're in at the moment. But I guess a synopsis of what the coalition's all about.
So it's a network collective, is what it says on the tin, a coalition of organisations, diverse organisations, who committed to really maximising the wider social benefits or the positive social change that sport can support, and particularly intentionally, strategically designed community sports interventions. But then the second part that really brings together the network is that those benefits should be enjoyed without barriers and discrimination. And I think there's a need to look at data and evidence. There's enough evidence that there are inequalities in the communities across the UK, individuals who are enjoying the benefits of sport and physical activity. So that's certainly on the radar of the coalition. It involves voluntary community organisations, charities, there's sporting bodies, there's academic institutions, there's non-sport actors who are working in.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's your typical member look like? But I'm pretty sure there isn't a typical member then.
No, and I think that's a strength, because one of the points I made at the very start of sometimes we get caught into thinking that sport is perceived as positive, physical activity is perceived as positive in most communities by most people. I think there's definitely an awareness that being active is important for your health, but the sort of perception of, well, what can community sport, what can sport-based interventions offer to myself, to my family, to my community, to my organisation are very different. So we have some organisations that are wholly sport, through to some organisations whose focus might be on criminal justice, might be on mental health and wellbeing, might be on gender equality. And that balance, I think, is a real strength of the coalition.
I guess membership at the moment is about 200 organisations, is it?
Yeah, it's just 220 odd, and probably overarch. It's a good number of thousand projects and programs, because a number of networks, bigger sort of networks like Street Games, SportEd, the Alliance of Sport and Criminal Justice, who have a range of different local and community organisations they work with. There's some multi-site organisations who have the Premier League Charitable Fund, the EFL Trust, active partnership. So I think there's this hook that brings a lot of the organisations together, is what can we share around maximising the positive impact of intentional use of sport. How do we best measure that to understand the impact? What does an enabling policy environment look like, particularly outside of sport policy? I think that's an important focus. And then what are the type of resources that need to be mobilised? Not just financial, but what's the workforce? What does it mean for provision of public leisure spaces? What does it mean for the use of the sort of almost 40% of stock or facilities behind school gates? And so there's a lot of sort of elements across those three sort of pillars around measuring impact, advocating for enabling policy environment, and unlocking resources for the sector, that I think there's an opportunity for those organisations to really work collectively. And in fact, one of the things I'm often saying is, and that's an important part of the coalition, it's not actually an organisation. It is a collective and a coalition. There's about 35% of the organisations in the coalition are actively involved in the governance and management structures that are set up. And then, of course, a range of others are involved in some of the collective. So it's quite interesting work for an entity which is a collection of organisations rather than working for one organisation. Has its strengths, but also has its challenges.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, look, it sounds like you've got, in terms of the players, part of the network, generally anyone like a who's who of the sector, and all the influencers are in there. Do you find, that's one of my questions, the challenges, is it difficult to get that kind of consensus, bring people together, or is there a hierarchy in there in terms of, football takes precedence, or the Premier League coming in, or whatever it be? Because I know obviously community focus is huge for every organisation, but is there kind of, I guess, conflict or friction in there like there might be in any
I think organisations have different priorities and focus areas, but the majority of organisations, even some of those sort of those that are involved in the football space, they are the community club organisation side and the networks of those community club organisations. So there is that
really kind of collaborative already, right? Yeah. We've got
that singular sort of purpose on, look, we want to use this tool and we know that we've got to use it strategically, but we want to use this tool of sport and physical activity to deliver wider outcomes. Now, the exact tool and the use of that, of course, varies, but generally, I think that there's a common purpose. And a lot of the organisations and a lot of the organisations or the parts of the organisation involved in the coalition are much more in the public policy, third sector type area. And there's definitely competitiveness there as opposed to that sort of more commercial facing side of sport. So maybe that helps or not. I used to always have 54 sports ministers as my boss, so it's probably easier.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does that stack up? So obviously moving away from governmental roles, similar, like you said, 54 countries and each have got their representative. But what was it that kind of drew you to the role with the coalition? And obviously, is it right? You started in the middle of COVID. I don't know if it was locked down at the time or not, but moving on there. What was the kind of the draw that brought you into the organisation?
This is a sort of intergovernmental multilateral term, but it's the critical role that civil society organisations have if we're going to really maximise the impact of sport and physical activity. And we might call them voluntary community social enterprise organisations, might be community groups and what have you.
And it's what we saw in the pandemic, right? Exactly that coming to the forefront. Yeah.
Very much so. And I think what drew me into that space is there's an opportunity to work collectively, and in working collectively, really, I suppose, support the development of policy, the investment of resources that is beneficial for that collective and that group of organisations versus one or two particular organisations. And so having been very much on the policy and governmental side for the previous number of years, I think seeing the importance of that sort of civil society, voluntary community, social enterprise component and how important they are within sport, and particularly the use of sport as a tool for wider outcomes. That was what the real sort of individual motivation was. And hopefully it's an area, and I think this is where the UK context is probably leading in this regard. There's that real opportunity for a career pathway and for that to become people's purpose and, if you like, professional undertaking. It doesn't always need to be probably where I started on that other side of that component of sport, which is about the competitiveness, the elite. And then as we go across that continuum, I think that opportunity for that to really the pathway for more and more people who want to work in sport and physical activity because they have that real belief that if done well, and I think that's a very important, if done well designed, it can contribute to some of the sort of positive social outcomes.
Well, yeah, impact's there and everything you're doing day in, day out, you can kind of trace the impact and job satisfaction straight away. Just out of curiosity, in terms of the coalition, in terms of your role, like day to day, is there kind of an element of like lobbying or showcasing what the industry, what the sector's doing? Obviously, it's great, the connection with government, and you can actually see and maybe that kind of voice for the sector at large could have been missing in the past. Is that kind of one of your roles?
Yeah, I think probably call it more advocating, and then do see it as supporting those in policy spaces, whether officials, whether policymakers, what have you, in terms of framing policy and strategy that ensures that you do get the best return from that voluntary community social enterprise side of the sector. But there's definitely an element of showcasing the value of sport as a tool or an intervention within some of these other sort of policy areas. But what's important there is, and probably the point of difference for the coalition, is it's aggregating and showcasing that collectively, because what we often have in the sector is either individual sports or individual organisations really undertaking that advocacy role or that engagement role with policymakers or third sector charitable trusts and foundations or commercial partners. And really the reason that the organisations who established the coalition established it as a collective rather than, let's say, an organisation per se, was that it's important that sort of, if you like, collective voice and that aggregated voice as opposed to a specific intervention, a specific program or a specific organisation.
If you're looking at strategy and things like that, so a few years out now, but what's the kind of long-term vision? I know we're looking at growing the membership and get to the 400 mark, but is there any the pillar? I know we talked about the pillars, but is there anything, if you're looking 5 years out at your time, what you're working towards, what the coalition looks like out in the future?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably three elements that I highlighted, and it's really value to be able to sort of share them, because I think it does require the sort of collective, well beyond those who are involved in the network at present, to get involved in this sort of collective work, get involved in the network. And number one is that we have scaled data and, if you like, aggregated scaled data that's open access, that enables those who want to make the case for the sector, those who are having the case made to them about the sector, can access that scaled data, and going beyond just, if you like, the sort of focus on participation levels, physical activity levels, and how that looks. So I think that's one, is that sort of scaled aggregated data for all the benefits that will bring. I think number two is that there's been discernible, if you like, evolution of policy, particularly outside of sport, that clearly, if you like, recognises through to ring fencing resource for sport-based interventions. And we're further along in some areas, of course, the work within the education space, but there's probably work in criminal justice actually has been quite effective with some of the leaders in that space. But really that policy change to recognise and ring fence resource for effective sport-based interventions. And then finally, I think a shift towards the percentage of all organisations focus, which is on their own sort of organisational objectives and own organisational
survival, profit, etc.
To feeling part of a collective and having that sort of collective voice and that collective input, particularly to stakeholders outside of sport and to where the policy of the sector outside of sport. So at the moment it might be 95 organisation, 5%, others are 50-50, some are 40-60, but shifting along that, because I think is that of collective action, collective impact, and to really grow the impact of what we can do as a broader sector. If you like, taking off the hats of our organisation sometimes and really being part of that collective and engaging as part of that collective is probably the critical area. So scale data, that policy change, and that sort of shift towards sort of collective impact, collective action would be the three, if you like, medium-term objectives or outcomes, if I use that language.
For sure. Career to date, obviously a lot of experience in bringing people together, building consensus, working together with groups, etc. But have you developed any other, I guess, business philosophies over the time, or leadership approaches that you kind of that underpins how you go about your work?
Well, there's always, whenever I'm asked this question, it's always an interesting one I bring up. And where I grew up, you mentioned at the start of the pod, it's the traditional land of the Yagara and Yugarapul people language group in traditional name of the town I grew up in, West Tulma. So it gives me very valuable to sort of learn from some of the wisdom of, in that case, the traditional land of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. And they have a story about Tiddalik the frog. And one morning during the creation time, dream time, Tiddalik the frog woke up and he was very thirsty. And so he started to drink from the billabong, and he drank all the water from that billabong and then the adjoining river until he drank all the water on the lands. Now, obviously that caused a bit of an issue because a drought started. And so the Council of Animals came together and they sort of tried to decide what the solution was, because one person had all the resource. Now, they decided they'd just try and make Tiddalik laugh. All of them tried. None of them could get him to laugh until finally the eel came out. And the eel wasn't usually part of the Council of Animals. And he slithered and moved. Tiddalik started to giggle and eventually broke out into huge laughter. Water went everywhere. The billabongs and rivers were replenished. I found that's been a very valuable sort of story through life, because what it said to me is that actually, if we have an issue with inequality, actually everyone suffers. And so we really need to work collectively to address inequality. But secondly, some of the solutions here aren't from the traditional power structures. And you had the eel wasn't part of the Council of Animals. Yeah. I think are really good for me, if you like, whether it's a business mantra or what have you, but it's really been something from that sort of very effective wisdom of the traditional owners of the area where I grew up has helped guide me through my career.
Definitely keeping that perspective as well, framing the story day to day. It sounds great. One of the questions I always ask is like how you structure your day and your routines. So as a leader, and like I said, a lot of leading the network as well, a lot of people. I'm assuming travel's reduced significantly for you, but do you have a kind of a structure that you set out every day and some non-negotiables you have to achieve every day, or just action?
Probably the non-negotiable, and slightly linked to the type of role I have now and the type of roles I've had, is there needs to be some element of my day, obviously, where in my case it's facilitating, but previously it was contributing to an element of collective action. So actually, if I go through a day and there hasn't been an aspect where I've either facilitated or we're involved in a number of other collectives, haven't been part of collective action, only been part of what's sort of about my own role, my own organisation, then I think it's been an issue for me. So it's been something that's carried through, and perhaps it's coming from the multilateral intergovernmental space, coming from being part of a coalition. But the flip side of that is the amount that I've learned by giving some of my time to collective approaches, giving some of my time to collective action, I've got much more back in return. So whether that's routine of a day, but it's probably the one element of the checklist that I reflect on at the end of each day. Has it just been about my own role and my sort of, if you like at the moment, organisation, not the right word, but the entity I'm involved with, or has there been an element of engaging in collective networks, collective action, because of the benefits it brings being involved in those type of...
So kind of like asking that question, like almost what am I giving back today kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. But in a very precise way in terms of that engaging outside of... Because there's plenty of people whose organisations and role is giving back every day, but it might be within the parameters of their organisation.
Got it. Outside of your specific objectives or whatever, yeah.
Have I connected with another business? Have I connected with another organisation? Am I part of a group which brings together a number of businesses, a number of organisations, a number of entities? And it's one thing I think we can often fall into danger in sport industry sector of being within our own silo. But I can tell you one of the best sort of learnings of me is trying to reach out into other ministries, other departments, and they value, and then how you bring that.
Yeah. How does that normally come across? Is it they open doors open, welcoming, opening arms, or they kind of like looking at you sideways? What's you want?
Well, the one other mantra, if you like, that I always work to is start with the outcome. Because a number of times I've sat meeting, like with a minister, permanent secretary, what have you, and you start talking about sport, and if that's not their portfolio area, you can see straight away, that's not for me, that's not my business. Right. So starting with the outcome, and I think that runs across a whole range. If the element is improved health and well-being, if it is about connecting different people in the community, if it is about supporting pathways back into education or those excluded, that's got to be the start point. That's where the engagement and discussion starts, and then working back from there. Because yes, I've had a lot of either metaphorically or literal doors shut because we led with sport could be a contributor here. Not interested. That's just a game, or that's something for the elite or for sending teams away to the Olympics. So start at the end point, start with the outcome is probably what I'd learned.
No, it's a really good tactic for everyone. Yeah, to get everyone get them on the bus first before they know before they finally go into it. Yeah, brilliant. I just want to be respectful of your time. Last question for me is just looking at reflection one again. If you could go back and speak to you and give yourself some advice when you're starting out in your career, what one piece of advice would you go back in time and tell yourself back when you were just starting out?
Not everyone feels the same about sport and even physical activity as you do.
Yeah. And
don't make the assumption they're getting the same outcomes and same results or same benefits that you are.
No, I love that one. I think we can all be guilty. In the sector, we can all be guilty of that, I think, at some point. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for giving up so many really valuable insights. We'll get anything linked in the show notes. But yeah, I just want to say a big thank you, mate.
No, I appreciate you inviting me on. I've enjoyed the conversations.
Thank you for listening to this week's show. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can write to us at dryphase.podcast@coordinate.cloud, tweet us at coordinatesport, or follow us on Instagram at coordinate_sports, or on my account at James_ventures. This episode was produced by Nancy Kwamboka, with support from Claire Goodchild and Lola Small, with special thanks to Rochelle. I'm James Moore, and you've been listening to The Drive Phase from Coordinate Sport.